Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much for taking the
Hi.
time. It's so good to officially meet you. I was poking around on the amazing universe of your book and your TED Talk, and it's clear watching that and seeing the language you use in your books. You come to this work, to your field, with so many different tools outside of just PT. I'm curious, what are some of the trainings or wisdoms you
Right.
bring to practice?
I was trained as a women's health physical therapist, so I have a foundation in anatomy,
Yeah.
physiology, medical language, and all of that. But I've studied a lot of bodywork practices, cranial sacral, myofascial release. So I've worked a lot with the body. It would be closest to maybe Chinese medicine or just understanding that the body has
Yeah.
wisdom if we can read it. And so for me, the body was the greatest teacher where I started to listen. I took notes for about a decade. I took notes after every
Mm,
woman that came in, what I learned from her body, really trying to understand what was the medicine that was given in that session and how
mm.
could I translate it into different care practices that would honor that knowledge or that would help bring that person closer to the knowledge that they might have gotten fractured from because of trauma or difficult birth or just living in a patriarchal culture.
For me, it took me until I'd say even my early 30s to realize I had a body. And I know that sounds absurd, but I was so
Oh,
disassociated and not from any capital T trauma, more just around, you work in these environments. And I always felt like my body was here to serve me versus being a
right.
part of me. And it takes so long
Absolutely.
to rewire all of those beliefs, but it's so healing. And I get really frustrated because so much of this work is scientifically sound, it's evidence based. There's, generations and generations of people doing this kind of work, but
Right.
still gets relegated to the woo in a lot of
Yes.
Western society. I'm curious, like, who are the kinds of practitioners you're working with right now? Is that mainly PTs or more broadly? And what's the scope of the gaps they're trying to fill that you're supporting?
Well, so when I was trained as a women's health PT, I tended to work more with fascia. I wrote a lot about that because I didn't see it in the literature. And so when I made the choice to teach, I wanted to teach more broadly than PT because I thought there were a lot of different providers that could benefit from it. So I have MDs, I have DOs, I have chiropractors, I have nurses, massage therapists. I had a really fun experience where the naturopathic school here in town, somehow some of the students started finding out what I was doing. So they wanted to study with me. So I was teaching some of the students that were going to be naturopaths. And their clinical director, who is near retirement, said she saw them healing things and working with women on things that she had never seen addressed in any way and having results. She wanted to come and study it so she could understand it. It gave her a depth of understanding because of the way I've learned to work with the body is so integrative and really body led. When I started working this way with the body, I was having a lot of just women feeling more integrated, more whole, more healthy, more connected, resolving their symptoms, things that made the woman
Yeah.
in front feel more whole. And it felt like such a key part of healthcare that I wanted more providers, more women to have access through different types of providers. So that's how I teach now. And I do teach globally. And
Mm.
it's so satisfying to be in different communities and different types of people and women and just see them take the work, take it in, and then work in their communities. It's very satisfying.
This concept of body led healing or body led therapy or PT, what does that actually mean in practice? If someone's showing up for a session?
It's personalized. So I think one thing we should
Yeah.
know about mechanistic models of care is they're kind of one size fits all. When I say holistic, I mean it's centered to the person in front of me, what they're coming in for, what they're struggling with, what they need support for. So it is very adaptive. There are some structures to it that give it a form
Yeah.
and knowledge. And it's body led in that I'm working with the patterns in that person's body. So I'm taking what their desire is for their well-being,
Hmm.
for their care, and I'm matching it to what is their body showing. What are the trigger points in the pelvic muscles? What is the fascial restriction? Fascia is kind of like saran wrap and it wraps around the organs and the muscles. That is a key part of our healthcare as women. So understanding that. I'm also teaching the person in front of me how to care for their body. So I'm giving them anatomical knowledge, but it's all done in a kind of an honoring way of who that person is and where they're
Yeah.
coming. Trauma informed. It's definitely gender inclusive. There's also identity wrapped in there. There's culture. It's very honoring of, women sometimes, like, for example, might come in after a traumatic birth. And I'm
Hmm.
holding space for the pain, but also the potential for their healing. And that's how I always walk with trauma. It's not just the trauma imprint. I want to get all the way to the healing where they feel whole or honored or respected.
I'd love to double click a little bit on fascia because it's something that we don't talk as much about explicitly. Maybe talk a little bit about why the fascia is so important and how
Right.
do we start to use that in our day-to-day lives?
Well, fascia wraps through every organ, around every muscle. It is a communicative layer. It is a layer that gives structure, but it's meant to be dynamic, but it can get adhesed. So if you have falls, if you have inflammation, if you have an episiotomy, if you've had surgery, it can get kind of restricted. And then a lot of times it's the cause of pelvic pain. So when women have pelvic pain, it is usually the fascia. And so having really good hands-on skills and working with that. But my frustration is a woman may go to many providers and not even get proper care for that. And I would love to have more information about that as a root cause, so that women aren't going to providers and saying, well, is it in my head? Is it my personality? Is it I'm uptight? It's like fascia is a real dynamic part of our structure, but it can get adhesed for various reasons. And then it can cause restrictions, pain. It definitely impacts the hormonal flow. Fascia is probably one of the ways they think that maybe acupuncture works, is because you're working through the fascia. On another layer, it's crystalline. So it's kind of like that body to spirit layer. It's a very subtle layer, but it's very powerful, holds a lot of information. And it's sometimes where I work on trauma, unpacking trauma, how the body releases trauma is a little different than the mind. I could go on and on about fascia. I mean, it's to me, it's the secret sauce in the pelvic bowl.
Yeah. And actually, I would love to just talk about the language you use, because everyone uses the phrase pelvic floor, and you've been talking about pelvic bowl. What's the difference, and why is it important?
I think because the floor to me is just one part. By the time I got into women's health PT, I had so many anatomical terms for my female organs and my body that felt dissociative to me and not really relational. And as I got more into the work with the body, I started to feel more creativity, more poetry, a depth of expression that I wanted to give voice to. And so to me, part of it is the pelvic bowl is more, it's the organs, the ovaries, the womb, the whole experience. It is wrapped in things like identity and birth loss, and just all the layers that make up lineage, is part of that. So it's more, it's deeper and it's richer, and also it's more earthy. Like, we have been the bowl and basket makers in communities for generations. We're the containers, we're the glue, we're the ones that hold things together. And to me, that was just more expressed. So I started changing my language, like I talk about pelvic medicine and root medicine and pelvic bowl, and, a lot more of this sort of like the potential of what's there in the body that is also feels more connective.
That's really beautiful, especially now as folks are getting introduced to these concepts for the first time. How do we introduce it in a way that is more associative and personal to what you're describing?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You were alluding to the ways that the mind releases trauma or grief or shock. And I can totally relate to that. I was in talk therapy for a very, very long time. And then finally it was like, I'm not stressed anymore, I swear, but my shoulders are still, up to my ears. And my pelvic floor is still clenched all the time. And I ended up going down both the path of pelvic floor therapy, but somatic therapy. And it's been game changing for me. I'd love to hear, what does it mean to, through a therapeutic exercise, actually release grief or trauma or shock?
I do a lot of body sensing, and some of the work I do, the holistic pelvic care, is designed to tap into not only the places where we hold things, but also where the medicine is. So even, I don't remember if you heard this story or it's in the book, but I started writing Wild Feminine just the day after 9/11. And I had a whole group of women the next day. So that was 2001. And I'm here in Portland, Oregon. And there were like 8 women, and every single one had a trauma pattern. And by a trauma pattern, I mean trigger points. Fascia has a way of it kind of constricts, and it just, it feels like raw, and energetically, it kind of has a feeling like static. If you've ever been in a car accident or something, that's kind of, it's like this trauma gets activated. It was like that in every single woman. And I remember thinking, first of all, this is interesting. Our bodies record trauma as women. Like we record a trauma event, like this is an active layer collectively going down in real time. And then also, we don't want to stop with the trauma. We want to get to the medicine, right? So for me, that means massage, body sensing, it's orientation. It's like when you are in trauma, you're usually disoriented and you're not present time. So it's orienting literally to your body, feeling your feet on the ground, feeling your roots. So there's body sensing aspects to it. I work with balancing exercises that have been developed for years of time of working with bodies and understanding how to balance the bowl so that you feel more grounded and more centered. So it's like both bringing things up, things come up, then it's recentering in a way that feels grounded and whole and in the moment and in the resources, not just the wounding.
I think, and you write about this, there are so many implications that can happen because of either the trauma or the grief or the shock that kind of sits with us. And it could be creative and sexual, or it could be intellectual. I mean, it can play out in our lives in so many different ways. And I'm curious for you, and I've been thinking about this also with my daughter now. How do we start young? How do we both not just heal the folks that need healing, but also ideally change the narrative, go forward?
Change the narrative. I will say it's a work in progress, as I have, older children that I feel like I thought I changed the narrative for, but then they have to live in an associative world. I think part of it is that connecting back to the body. So first, giving them a lot of touch, being in our own bodies so that we are in, body with them, doing playful things. And like the body's very simple in some ways. It likes rest, it likes play, it likes food, it likes to laugh, and it seems simple, especially if you're in your head, but are we taking time for those things? Are we taking time for rest? Are we taking time for, a good hug and really feeling it? We'll seed them through time to stay connected to their body. And then my niece was starting to bleed, and she was on a soccer team, and it was rainy, cold in Oregon. And she was like, oh, I've got cramps. And I said, you can go play soccer, and I want you to feel like empowered to do what you want, but it is okay to also take a rest night. You can choose. And that to me is what empowered body looks like. You have the information and then you get to choose. And then the other thing too, I think, is medical authority. I talk to my kids that they're starting to go into their appointments just saying, what, you get to ask questions. It's like not handing your authority over, which is a more patriarchal version of medicine, but really understanding if you're even going to go through a procedure, you can ask questions because there are always options. Or even with my college kids, when they needed antibiotics, you can ask for a shorter course, or what's the option here. That's all part of being centered in the body.
And probably to your point, you have to start with yourself too, as an individual and as a parent, and then you can authentically teach that too.
Yeah. And it's an imperfect journey. I think there's a lot of messages in the world, although maybe the pandemic gave us a little permission for something different, but there's a lot of messages to ignore your body. And so, just making space for a body-centered life, even if it's awkward.
Can I ask you one quick follow-up? You had talked about the pelvic bowl and immunity, and I don't actually think we talk about that often.
It's part of the immune system. It's part of it. It clears things out. You think of the menstrual, it's like, what don't I need? It clears it out. And same with fluids. We should be flowing and moving things. This is part of our clearing system, just like your nose or your mouth, like it's part of our clearing system. And if we congest that with tension, with fascial disruption, we're going to have more dis-ease, literally. So understanding how to empower our true health is key.